Aviation has one of the biggest challenges coming.
For an airport like, let's say, Heathrow, in terms of size, it would be equivalent to building a completely new terminal. You had hybrid electric cars. I think it'll be the same with aviation. The number of people who fly is projected to double by the 2040s.
There is a lot of rumours about very lightweight, very long lasting, very powerful batteries.
I think that Gatwick's second runway should go ahead because it's easier and you don't have to move the M25.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very excited today. It's the day after World Book Day, and we have a fantastic guest. We have the author of Sustainability in the Air. Can I please welcome Dirk to the Wolf Power Club?
Thank you very much for having me, Alex.
So, today I'm excited. Now, I always bang on about my family on the energy side in terms of, what my father did and my grandfather did. But what I can also say is on the other side of my family, we had a few aviation entrepreneurs. And my grandfather, John Sommerfeld, he actually did the aviation technique of Sommerfeld track, where he could lay track underneath the fields of Britain so that Spitfires and Hurricanes could land during World War II. However, aviation has one of the biggest challenges coming, and I've read the fantastic book, and apparently between now and the early 2040s, aviation's emissions could go from 2% to 22% of the world's emissions problems that we're looking at. So, Dirk, why then has Airbus decided to change its timelines and positions on hydrogen?
So, obviously a bit of context. I remember being at the Farnborough Air Show in 2022, and I was sitting in an Airbus press conference, and Airbus was telling everyone that yes, by 2035, they will have a hydrogen-powered narrow body in the skies, about over 100 seats, so an A390 and A320 equivalent. And the word then was that this was definitely going to happen. Since then, it's these commitments have steadily been sort of watered down until very recently, a few weeks ago, we heard that French unions said that it was going to be delayed by 5, possibly 10 years. So call it 10 years. So we're talking 2045, or if at all. And the reason for that, I think, is very, very simple. There's two things. Number one is that both Airbus and Boeing have a backlog of aircraft orders that stretch well into the next decade. And if you are, a major corporation, why would you disrupt, a highly profitable product line and technology in which you've spent billions in over the decades, and where the demand is far higher than the supply, in favor of something new, which is unproven. And the crucial point is that hydrogen requires a totally different infrastructure. So obviously it's one thing to actually, build the hydrogen aircraft. And there are companies like ZeroAvia around, which have successfully done test flights of hydrogen powered aircraft, but you need the infrastructure to go around with it. So you need, you need a way of making green hydrogen. You need a way of transporting it. You need a way of storing it, all of which have various technical challenges. And for an airport like, let's say, Heathrow, if they wanted to switch, to hydrogen operation, in terms of size, it would be equivalent to building a completely new terminal. So there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of complexity, a lot of money involved, and that, in a nutshell, is why I think that that Airbus is, even though in theory they're still committed to it, why they're cooling on it somewhat.
And is there, still focusing on hydrogen, is there, because I was reading in the book, a number of different companies that are taking a number of different approaches to sustainable aviation. Is there any hope in hydrogen, maybe on smaller aircraft, or any breakthrough? Because you've dedicated the last best part of the decade to researching all the different tech that's coming out in the aviation space. Is there anyone that's saying actually it might not work on an Airbus scale, but there is someone that's got some positive news on hydrogen at the moment?
Yeah, I think so. I mentioned ZeroAvia, which was in the first volume of the book. They're a British and American company that is developing hydrogen electric engines. So hydrogen electric, meaning that hydrogen powers a fuel cell, which then powers an electric motor, and that will be used to initially retrofit smaller regional aircraft. And you can see, I mentioned the infrastructure problem. Areas such as the Highlands and Islands of Scotland or New Zealand or what have you, where you have a cluster of airports which are hydrogen enabled, I think for a use case like that, I can definitely see it moving forward.
Wow, that's really exciting. I mean, I like going to outer Scotland airports. I'd recommend any of our listeners and viewers. It's great if you can get on flights to the Outer Hebrides. There's even some where you actually land on a beach rather than a runway, so it's very, very exciting. Now, concentrating more on sort of regional flying, there's one government that seems to have made a very, very big position on regional flights. They've obviously got a country where it's very inaccessible when you don't fly, and we're talking about Norway. And Norway has said by 2040 they want the flying to be electric. Is that just a pipe dream, or is there real breakthroughs happening on electric flying?
No, I mean, Norway and also actually Denmark and Sweden have mandates in place that, the domestic flights need to be, fossil fuel free within the next decades. And I mean, we mentioned hydrogen. Technologies like hydrogen, also electric aviation, lend themselves much more to regional and commuter routes. I mean, I mentioned some of the problems with hydrogen in terms of the infrastructure. There's also the energy density, and you have to redesign the aircraft. With electric, there are electric aircraft that are flying today. The problem is with the battery, with the energy density of the battery, and also the durability, because obviously if you're flying an aircraft, regional aircraft, it's going through multiple rotations every day. It needs to withstand a lot of charging, and the sector's been held back by that so far. I mean, one of the companies that's actually in the first and also in the second volume book is Heart Aerospace, which is a Swedish company. It's also based in the United States, and they are building a 30-seater aircraft called the ES30, which will work on these regional routes. And you can see it working somewhere like Norway or Sweden and also other areas of the world as well. And in fact, to get across the battery energy density issue, a lot of these companies are switching from pure electric to hybrid electric. So let's say from a Tesla to the skies to a Prius in the skies, to extend the range and to so that the battery doesn't take up as much of the of the volume of the aircraft. So that seems to be sort of the way forward. And much like you had hybrid electric cars that gained traction on our roads before electric cars, I think it'll be the same with aviation. But yes, there are companies around that are developing aircraft like this. There'll be regional aircraft, as I said, about 19 to 30 seater. They will work on regional routes. I mean, certainly by 2040, I think it'll be very possible. Heart's goal is to have an aircraft up and running by certainly by 2030, if not before then.
And what I liked about the Heart story, and it was similar, we previously on the Wolf Power Club have had Whisk, the electric brand owned by Boeing. And both Whisk and Heart, and when I'm reading your book about Heart, talk about how that once it's up and running, that an electric aircraft will have much lower maintenance costs than existing technology. Could you explain to our listeners why that is the case, and actually why it might be one of the economic reasons that long-term electric aviation might have a chance?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's the same with cars. I mean, just like electric cheaper to maintain because of electric engines, so it is the case with electric aircraft. And I think that this is a good example of where a more sustainable aviation solution can benefit communities culturally and economically and socially as well. I mean, Anders Forslund, who is the CEO of Heart Aerospace, I mean, at conferences, he tends to show this chart of the United States of commuter air services, regional air services that existed in the 1990s that don't today. And those routes became unprofitable, so they were, pulled out of service. The potential of electric aviation, it can make unprofitable routes profitable again, and it can really result in a renaissance in short regional aviation, and bring flying much closer to communities because, as we said, it's cheaper, the aircraft cheaper to operate, and also crucially, it's much quieter. Noise is obviously a huge issue for anyone who lives near an airport, and electric aircraft get around that issue. And then, of course, it's zero emissions, so the environmental angle as well.
It's great. It was very funny. A few years ago, I was on Alaska, and the tour guide was very, very funny because I think some people who might, live in city centres like London, like, well, why do you need regional aviation to get a place? But when I was in Alaska, the tour guide was very funny. She said there's 3 ways to get into these parts of Alaska. One is cruise ship. The second is seaplane, and the other is birth canal, which I found very, very funny.
Right.
Said that.
Well, I mean, there you go. And not only in places like Norway or Alaska, but think of the Philippines, or think of Indonesia. Sort of large countries with dispersed populations and with lots of remote islands, and you could see that the electric aircraft could really make a difference in places like that.
Yeah, and I think also like Australian outback. I've had friends that have both been in the vet service and the medical service. I know we all enjoyed that TV program, Flying Doctors, but it's a reality when you've got the space of where essentially you've got farms as big as countries in Europe.
Right.
Is that you need that sort of regional aviation solution. But one of the solutions that has had a lot of press, it's fair to say that when Wolf Power Club was at Farnborough last year, everyone seemed very excited, was about SAF. However, when I've been at International Energy Week in the last few weeks, it's fair to say I was at the S&P Platts Economics Forum. They were showing that still the gap between SAF and normal aviation fuel or jet is so big. And I also met an energy company that's put vast infrastructure into SAF, but really struggling to get customers on the journey. So where are we with SAF? Where is it between that optimism of Farnborough last year and the concerns of the economics of the fuel suppliers at International Energy Week this year?
So, I mean, let's first of all unpack what sustainable aviation fuel is. I mean, obviously, sustainable aviation fuel is alternative fuels that aren't fossil fuel based. And broadly speaking, there are 3 generations of SAF. The first one is what's called HEFA, and 90% of the world's SAF today is made by this system. It's essentially used cooking oil that is then sort of refined and put into aircraft. Virgin Atlantic at the end of 2023 had the first flight all powered by SAF across the Atlantic, and that was made mainly from HEFA-based fuels. Now, the idea of used cooking oil being used to power your aircraft, I mean, it sounds pleasing, right? You go down to your local fish and chip shop or your takeaway and what have you, and maybe that could be powering your next flight. That's not actually what happens, because we don't produce enough used cooking oil to power these aircraft. So in practice, what we do is we import it from China and Malaysia. So you have the strange situation of fossil fuel powered vessels bringing this stuff in from halfway around the world, and there's questions about the provenance of it as well, and whether palm oil is getting into the mix. That is generation 1, and most SAF today is that. Generation 2 is something called alcohol to jet, which is basically methanol refined and made into fuel. It can be made from corn. It can be made from specialized fuel crops called silvergrass. It can be made from sugarcane, from various things. And there's also municipal waste stuff. And then third generation, which is the newest one and the most promising one, is something called e-fuels or power to liquid fuels, which is where you take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, you mix it with green hydrogen, and then through various processes you have fuel at the end of it. Now, getting back to the point of cost, IASA had a report out last week which showed that SAF at the moment is between 2 and 11 times more expensive than Jet A. And as you say, sort of unless you are made to, and there are mandates in place in the UK and the European Union about using SAF, no business is going to replace what they have at the moment with a more expensive equivalent. So the question is, we have to drive this cost down. E-fuels made out of CO2 and capture carbon dioxide and hydrogen are extremely expensive. HEFA-based SAF less so. There's some issues with that, and really, we need to. Well, there needs to be economies of scale. Where we mass produce this stuff. I know you were at Energy Week last week, and one of the complaints that the aviation industry has is that the oil majors are retreating from SAF because it is a longer term investment and the extremely profitable and short-term gain of extracting oil from the ground, and there's a lot of capital expenditure involved. But until we get these economies of scale, the price will not go down, and that's really where we are. So yes, it's possible. Yes, it's promising. Yes, it works with today's technologies, which is why Airbus, going back to the Airbus questions, has moved away from from hydrogen, as concentrating more on SAF. But there's not enough of it, and it's too expensive, and we need to work on that.
And talking about e-fuels for our listeners, if you go back to our previous episodes, you'll see we've got the CEO of ET Fuels, and she talks about the developments they're doing across Europe and America to bring e-fuels to the market. But when I look at the SAF question, it was very interesting because I spoke to one of these oil executives, so to speak, and without naming the company, where they sort of pushed back. There's two areas of pushback. One was the sort of unwillingness of airlines to go across, even though it's a drop in fuel, and they felt that the taxation systems of the various states and countries aren't yet developed enough to show the true cost of the impact of the free scopes of carbon. And the other bit that they felt that was a real challenge was that aviation, in most people's minds still, isn't that big an impact on the environment when you talk about it being 2%, but your book mentioned that it could go up to 22%. Where does that growth come from? And I think there's also various trends that lead to that.
Yeah, so I mean, it is about 2.5 to 3%, but that's a figure that's been bandied about for quite a few years. I think that the reality is that it's higher at the moment. In fact, for the UK, I believe it's about 7 to 9%, because of course we are an island country, and we are very heavily dependent on aviation. So for starters, that 3% figure is a little bit misleading, because it ignores countries like the UK or Ireland or Netherlands or New Zealand, where where flying accounts for a large part of our carbon budget. And yes, I mean, the number of people who fly is projected to double by the 2040s, driven largely, not exclusively, by growth in emerging economies, so especially in Southeast Asia, in India, in China, as some of these countries become more, as various demographics become more economically well off, they have the ability to fly. Also, countries like India are expanding their aviation infrastructure with things such as low cost carriers and airlines taking shape there. So that will kind of drive the growth of aviation. That is why we will have, in the next 15 years, a lot more people flying than they are today. To answer the question of your contact, who said, well, it's only 2.5-3%. Why is aviation getting so much attention? What environmentalists and climate activists say to us is that the reason why aviation is in the crosshairs, so to speak, is because most people do not fly. 80% of the world at the moment does not fly, so it's seen as something discretionary. And if we cast our minds back to COVID, most people didn't fly, and life carried on, business life carried on, at least much as normal, and we adapted. So that is the argument that they point to about why aviation is being targeted in the way that it is. It's seen as an inequitable form of emissions, if you like.
And I think that leads sort of nicely to, we did a little exercise at Wolf Power Club in that we went round Battersea Power Station, and we had a two-pronged question, and if people want to see it, they can watch our TikTok or Instagram, and our questions to the public were, has climate change affected you in the lifetime? And everyone's like, oh, yes. I struggle to breathe in London and so on. And the next question was, well, how many flights did you take last year? And I think the answers range from about 2 to about 60, with lots of answers in between. And I think also, I would say that some of the best experiences of my life have either come from travel or meeting groups of people abroad.
Yes.
I've got family in multiple countries. And what we are truly passionate about in the Wolf Power Club is that we know that when it comes to energy answers, human beings will always want a warm house, a hot shower, and the ability to fly.
I agree.
So what I'm interested in, because you are one of the leading experts, you've done unbelievable research, what's the hope? Because I think most of us in that camp, we want to fly, we probably want a nice environment as well. So where's the hope that you see coming into the sector at the moment, and some of the big breakthroughs that may well be talked about at Paris and developed on it between now and 2030?
So to take your point about, the fact that as human beings, we want a better life and we want a higher standard of living. I mean, there's a renowned climate scientist called Professor Catherine Hayhoe, and there's a quote that she made that I remember, which she said, one of the problems of the environmental movement, she said, is that it is based on what she called an ethos of sacrifice, that you have to do without. And if you don't do without, then you're a bad person. And as you've just pointed out, that is very unappealing to the mass of people, because as human beings, we want a higher standard of living. Both of us are parents. We want better, we want better lives for our children. And that is kind of what we have to concentrate on. Where I see the hope, I mentioned things like electric, is that sustainable solutions can make life better. And that's what we have to concentrate on. Electric aircraft, as I said, can rejuvenate, regional aviation and bring flying closer to people. I also see hope that there are solutions around, that we can grasp quite easily. I mean, the second volume of the book, we have a chapter all about contrails, so the white lines you have up in the sky, and contrails account for possibly between a third and half again of aviation's total emissions. Now, that can be dealt with quite easily simply by altering flight paths. And there's a group in Brussels called Transport and Environment, and they did a study, and they estimated that the cost to the passenger would be about €4, a cup of coffee per flight. So we have solutions at hand that can be done now, that can be done easily. We also have solutions in the medium to long term, some of the innovators that we've been talking to, who hopefully get us there by the 2040s and 2050s.
I think that is really exciting, and I think also I think the day that that first flight that, as you said, like Heart Aerospace do with 30 people on an electric plane, it feels tantalizingly close, because a lot of them have, as you say, deadlines either before 2030 or around that mark. Do you ever see a time where essentially a very common flight in the UK is the UK to the US, whether it's to the East Coast of New York or whether it's more to the West Coast of your LA, San Francisco's and so on, or the business community going from London to Washington, the two political capitals of the countries? Where do you see the tech on one of those very popular routes going long term? Will it be a sort of generation 3 SAF, or do you think it'll be something else?
So it will, SAF is really the sort of the only viable solution in the medium to long term for medium and longer range flights, because the technology in terms of electric and hydrogen aviation is not there to power those aircraft over longer distances. So we will need these drop-in fuels, and you mentioned e-fuels. E-fuels is the most promising solution because they have the highest carbon reduction of over 90%, because essentially you're taking carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and the CO2 comes out the other end of the engine. So that's probably where where longer term aviation is going. Having said that, I did speak to one battery company called Ampere Amprius in the US. And they claimed that by the 2030s that there might be a battery that is good enough to power a business jet across the Atlantic. So who knows what's going to come in terms of innovation.
I'll certainly take that question to solar and storage, where we're going in April.
Right.
And they've got the world market there. But there is a lot of rumours about very lightweight, very long lasting, very powerful batteries. And I have a feeling that at some point there is going to be one of those sort of eureka moments that comes through. There's a lot of challenge to it because people say looking at the physics and so on. Now, we obviously spent a lot talking about sort of sustainable aviation and so on. But just for our listeners, and I will reveal my card first, do you have a favourite aircraft at all? Certainly from my childhood, the favourite aircraft has to be the Vulcan bomber. The reason I'd say it is that it kind of symbolised the sort of detente of Cold War, but also for me as a kid, it was like a sort of camouflage version of a Concorde. The noise was incredible seeing it at Farnborough and various air shows. Sad that they're not flying these days. I donate to the fund, but it's brilliant when you go to Duxford and see it in the hangar. Do you have a favourite type of aircraft at all that for you sort of really brings you joy when you see it and hope?
Yeah, for me it would be the A380, and it's because of the passenger experience. I think even in economy, it delivers a superior, sort of passenger experience to other, long haul aircraft of its type. And of course, it's great to look at. Sadly, of course, they're not being produced anymore. And I think that Emirates, which is by far the largest operator of the A380, is intending to keep its A380 fleet active, I think, until the 2040s, and then we'll probably say goodbye to it.
I gotta say, with the A380, a big part of it was made in Hamburg, and when I was working for a fuel company in Germany, I'd go to Hamburg reasonably often, and not as the same civilian airport, but when you flew into the civilian airport, you went over the Airbus construction thing.
Yes.
And that was amazing. I mean,
Sure.
you'd see multiple A380s being built, and it was just absolutely incredible as they were assembling them there. And I genuinely think, as you say, it's one of the aircraft. If you've never flown an A380, book a trip on it, guys, as I say, because it's mind blowing, isn't it, when you go to sort of row 98 or something
Right.
on the aircraft, and it's a fabulous experience. So very kindly, listeners, Dirk has said that there is a couple of copies we can give away to our audience. So to get a copy within the next 7 days, if you follow us on LinkedIn or you comment on the post, we will enter you into a draw, and we look forward to sending out those copies. We'll also put a link of where, if you're not a lucky competition winner, where you can buy it. But how can people keep in touch with you, Dirk, before we go into our quickfire questions about the energy industry?
Look me up on LinkedIn. I mean, you'll find me there. Or some of the pieces that I've written, some of the reports and some of the profiles on startups, you can find at green.simpliflying.com.
And just before we go into our quick fire questions, what are the sort of really good aviation events to go to if you want to learn more about this journey on transition and see the industry key players? I presume Paris must be up there coming up this year.
Yeah, I'll be going to Paris in June. I'm also going to the Dubai Air Show in November. But also, a lot of climate events. One of the biggest ones is New York Climate Week, which happens at the same time as the UN General Assembly in the third week of September. And that's a great gathering point of people in the sustainability and the sustainable tech and climate tech industries. And I think anyone who's interested in the space, I'll be there. should definitely go along to that.
Thank you very much for letting us know where we should be going in 2025. I certainly know the Wolf Power Club, we loved Farnborough last year. We're just trying to sort a few things to go to Paris. But we've got a few quickfire questions that we ask all of our guests. The first one is, right now, where would you be investing time or money in the energy sector, but with your strengths specifically around aviation? Where should the energy industry be investing next with aviation?
Okay, so I used to give an answer about a year and a half ago that I've changed, and I used to say that if you gave me $1 million, I would put it into electrolyzer production. So obviously electrolyzers make green hydrogen, as you know, sort of in split water into H2 and oxygen. Because green hydrogen you need sort of produce clean hydrogen fuel, and also it's one of the feedstocks for e-fuels. I now wonder whether there is there's that much efficiency that we can get from electrolysis. And talking about this point we made about bringing the cost of e-fuels down, I think we need to look at alternative sources of clean hydrogen. One of the most promising areas is so-called white hydrogen, or natural hydrogen, which is hydrogen extracted from the ground. And Bill Gates' Breakthrough Energy has put a lot of money into companies in this space. And certainly the companies that do that say that they can produce hydrogen that is cost competitive with fossil fuel derived hydrogen. And this comes back to when I was at New York Climate Week last week. I asked the CTO of an e-fuels company, I said, what will it take to make your fuel cost competitive with Jet A? And he said, give me cheap hydrogen and I will give you cost competitive fuel. So I would put it into these new sources of clean hydrogen that are cheaper than green hydrogen made by electrolysis.
Okay. In the next 12 months, what would you like the British government to do? And the reason I ask that is that there's a lot of rumours that have come out from the FT yesterday that essentially in the spring statement there's going to be financial cuts to GB Energy. And I was just wondering, what do you want the British government to do? But also they've made a lot of noises about growing Heathrow and Gatwick. So in the next 12 months, what would you like the British government to do in this area?
So first of all, on the Heathrow Gatwick question, I mean, I'm a skeptic about the Heathrow's third runway. I mean, I personally think that Gatwick's second runway should go ahead because it's easier, it's cheaper, it can be done sooner, and you don't have to move the M25. So as you do with Heathrow. So that's where I stand on that. So if I was advising, is it Heidi Alexander who's the Transport Secretary, that is probably what I would suggest. But in terms of what I would like them to do, I mean, we talked a lot about the price and the availability of SAF, and the government has talked about introducing called a price certainty mechanism, which is that investors, like some of the contacts you've been talking to, that if they put in the enormous, the hundreds of millions of pounds, dollars and euros that it takes to build a SAF plant, that they have a reasonable guarantee of a return at the end of it. That the UK government will guarantee a certain price point, which means that these companies, that the oil majors, have the confidence to go ahead and buy the facilities, that we need. So that is what I would probably look for, the price certainty mechanism from SAF, which is being discussed, which will be, developed.
Yeah, because I always find it. I mean, it's dominated my whole life, the Heathrow Gatwick question and the funding of alternative fuels. I knew very, very well sort of Zach Goldsmith, now Lord Goldsmith.
Right.
He obviously stood down from Parliament when the Conservatives backed on sort of supporting Heathrow when the original election said they wouldn't. I know it's really split the energy community. I'm very close to the energy community in Aberdeen, and it feels like the energy profit levies really hit that community in the last 12 months, but at the same time the government seems really positive about expanding Heathrow and Gatwick, so it just feels like on environmental things there's not a balance of opinion there. And the other bit that does blow my mind,
actually, I mean, sort of the UK government could be in the situation where they could be expanding 5 London airports at once, because Luton and Stansted are also looking for expansion plans, and City is looking to take the A320. So we could have this situation where all London airports, are sort of have an expansion boom at the same time. But personally, I think that Gatwick has the best case because of capacity and because of the what it will take to get that off the ground.
I think also like the M25 point is such a big point. So it's the busiest road in the UK.
Right.
And when you go to Gatwick, there is space there where you don't actually kind of conceive, other than disrupting the M25 for one of the biggest periods of history that ever the biggest road's been disrupted of doing. But I certainly think we will try and get Gatwick and Heathrow onto the podcast. It's a debate I absolutely love. I don't know the answer, guys, but I absolutely love it. My next quickfire question is, what do you want customers to do? And we normally talk about like energy customers, but I see that Lufthansa has brought in the last year or so an option that you can add almost like an environmental payment
green
on
fares.
Green fares. What would you like passengers to do in the next 12 months in terms of sustainable aviation?
So the way that these green fares work, and also SAS, Scandinavian Airlines, has something called Conscious Traveller, which is a very similar program, is you commit to purchasing a certain amount of SAF, and you have certain benefits when it comes to acquiring frequent flyer miles. Actually, British Airways, in their very controversial changes, their executive club system, if you buy SAF, then that will count a certain way to getting tier points. I personally think that, obviously I think that flying is a good thing, as we've discussed. I don't want to put people off flying. It brings a lot of economic, social and cultural benefits. What I would say, and this is something that we talk about a lot at SimpliFlying, is intentional flying. So, so if you take a business trip, can you combine it with a holiday at the same time? Can you cut down the number of flights you take? Is that trip really necessary? So I think what I would say is think about the flights that you do take. By all means, sort of everyone needs to go on holiday, it's crucial for business, for education, cultural purposes, but how can it be rationalized in some way? Also, direct flights are obviously much less carbon intensive than like stopping off somewhere. So that's also something that I would look at. And then newer aircraft and travel tools such as Google's Flight Engine, they do now have these CO2 calculators where you can see what is the most, less carbon intensive route for you to take.
Oh, that's fantastic. I'm going to look at that, and we'll probably link to that. And then the question we love asking all of our guests: who in your address book or contacts would be the best person next to have on the Wolf Power Club podcast?
So there's a really interesting company that we are featuring in the second volume called Electra. And the CEO there, Mark Allen, they are producing, obviously you've heard of eVTOLs, you had Risk on the program, and they are doing an eSTOL, so an electric short takeoff and landing aircraft. And the aircraft that they have will be short enough to land on a football pitch. And rather than eVTOLs, which can take 4 passengers, they can take 9. Rather than going just 100 kilometers, they can go several hundred kilometers. And I personally, and they're also cheaper to manufacture, cheaper to operate than eVTOLs. I think for these very, very short routes, they are a better bet than these electric air taxis. You could have it, they say they can land on, let's say, the Manhattan heliport. And if I was an airline, I would think, why am I not investing in that and using that to take people from Manhattan to JFK rather than these eVTOLs, which are expensive and have various issues. I mean, there's a case for eVTOLs, but I think that Electra provides a more compelling proposition. It's possibly a bigger future in it.
Do you think, because I mean, obviously where I see helicopters a lot is in Aberdeen. One of my favourite things, actually, it's a bit geeky, is I love sitting in my hotel room, seeing all the helicopters go offshore.
Right.
Do you think that this 9-seater electric tool, if it got all the approvals, could be something that did offshore work like that? Or would that be a sort of out of its comfort zone? Or
well, I mean, the eVTOL, so the electric air taxis, you say they could replace helicopters. And also, actually, the defense industry is looking into them a lot. And so, possibly for like oil rigs, they might be a better bet. But talking again, like the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, there's an eSTOL called the Britain Norman Islander, which can land on extremely short runways and strips of land. The Electra could take that off, and they could also take off, take on, as I said, let's say, think of an airport close to here, Biggin Hill to Heathrow. It could provide or Farnborough to Heathrow. It could provide a short commuter service that could take that on.
Dirk, it's been amazing having you on the Wolf Power Club today. Guys, this is an incredible read. I think also if you're interested in the business side of aviation, what I loved about this book, Dirk, was that you really went into the detail about where funding had come from, how the CEOs or the founders of these companies had really sort of had their eureka moment. And it's a really, really amazing book on the detail, because it really goes that full journey from funding through to test flights, through to the people who've made the decisions in the industry to say go from very, very big companies with established careers to startups that essentially have got risk, but that will probably give the agility to break the energy transition answers. I know you've got the second edition coming out later this year. What should we look forward to in edition 2?
Yeah, so Shashank and Nigam, my co-author, and myself, we're currently working on the second edition, which is out in May. We'll be profiling completely new stories, completely new companies. So I mentioned Electra, one of the ones that are in there. Heart Aerospace is in again. Jet Zero, which is a company that's developing a blended wing body aircraft, so actually reimagining what an aircraft should look like. We talked to some e-fuels companies. So we have a company called 12. And then we also talked to some large giants in this space. We have a whole chapter devoted to Boeing and to their SAF and program. And we've talked a lot in this show about sustainable aviation fuel. That chapter really goes into that. And then we have another SAF company called Gevo, which is producing alcohol to jet, which is a second generation SAF in the US. So it's new stories. I think that since we wrote this book 18 months ago, the sector has moved on a lot. We are now looking at green solutions that can scale, that are viable, and that offer benefits other than just being green. So this idea that the green premium, where people will pay more just because a product is sustainable, that's becoming increasing into question. And the products that will survive will be ones that either have price parity or that have some other kind of benefit other than sustainability. And that's one of the themes that comes through, in the next book.
Dirk, I'm absolutely delighted today. With your research, your publication, your intelligence, we've been able to cover hydrogen aviation. We've been able to cover, can a country like Norway break the electric thing by 2040? We've been able to cover the SAF debate, and we've been able to cover the green shoots that are coming out there like Electrum. It's been an absolute privilege to have you on the podcast. I think I will be getting my team to look at ways that we can be in Paris, because I got to say, I read this book, guys, on my journey back from Edinburgh, and I was like, this is getting me more excited than any other part of energy transition.
Thank you.
Really want to know your guys' views in the area. We've got a couple of these to give away. So remember, follow us on LinkedIn, to download on Apple, Spotify, and so on, and comment, and we'll enter you into the draw to win a couple of these copies. But we're also in the show notes, guys. If you click below, we'll have all the details into how you can see the news about the second edition coming out and to learn more about Dirk's work. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you so much.